Welcome everyone to the second event in the Shifting the Conversation lecture series event with ShiftSpace. So today we have Nellie Elliott here with us, and she is a senior at Wichita State University, majoring in art history and minoring in French, music, and women's studies. She's currently a curatorial intern at the Ulrich Museum of Art, where she primarily does research on artists and pieces for upcoming exhibits. Nellie's favorite area of study is American women artists in the early 20th century. Some artists she has recently studied include Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell, Florine Stettheimer, Isabel Bishop, and Imogen Cunningham. After graduating from WSU in December, Nellie plans to continue on to graduate school and hope to eventually work in the curatorial department of a museum. Today, Nellie will be speaking about the photographer Imogen Cunningham. Specifically, she will address Cunningham's early work in the pictorialist style and the significance of the veiled figure in Cunningham's early photographs. Welcome, Nellie.
Thank you. All right, so let me get my PowerPoint here. Okay, so as Carter said, today I'm going to be talking about several photographs from Imogen Cunningham's early career that feature the veiled figure. And so we'll be talking about how and why those are significant and how they figured in her work. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like to just give a quick overview of who Cunningham was for those who are not familiar with her. So she was born in 1883 in Portland, Oregon. She was a photographer and she began photographing in the early 1900s and continued all the way through the 1970s. And her subjects were very, she had a lot of variety in her subjects. She included portraits, street photography, the human form, and still life photographs. And as I said, her career spanned many decades throughout the 20th century. And so she also took part in many movements, including pictorialism, straight photography, and the F-64 group. And so from her early photographs to the latest, she was very interested in technical experimentation, composition, and things like that. She sought to elevate her photography from just documentary kind of science-based photography to the level of art. And so we see that throughout the course of her career. So here I have a very condensed timeline of her work, just to kind of give you an idea. Obviously, this doesn't do justice to the scope of her career, but I just wanted to, give you a broad idea. So starting here in 1905, we have Marsh at Dawn. And this is, I believe, considered the very first photograph that she took. And so we can see how it's very soft focus, which is characteristic of the pictorialist movement. And then we have 1915 on Mount Rainier. By 1925, we have the sharper focus Magnolia Blossom. And if we move on to the 1930s, we see the figures start to come into her work a little bit more. In the 1950s, we have street photography with fur and feathers at the art fair. 1965, we can see how she's experimenting technically with her portraits. And then in 1974, we have a self-portrait. So I'd like to talk a little bit about her early career, just because that's the area of her work that we're going to be focusing on the most. So to put things in perspective, she was born in 1883 in Portland, Oregon, and she was interested in art and photography from an early age. And her first photography-related education was through a correspondence course while she was still young, living at home. In 1907, she graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in chemistry. And so she knew that she wanted to be a photographer, but she studied chemistry so that she could understand the scientific and technical side of photography. After graduating, she went on to work as the assistant to Edward Curtis from 1907 to 1909. And then in 1909, she went to Germany to continue her studies. After that, in 1910, she returned to the United States. And these years were really important to her career. They were very formative, not just because of the education she received, but she made a lot of connections with people in the photography world that became really important to her career. So once she was back in the United States, she established her own portrait studio in Seattle. And during this period, she often photographed her family and friends and neighbors. She would kind of use them as characters in these staged scenes that she photographed. And so it was during this period that she produced several photographs that featured veiled figures, which is what we're going to be looking at and focusing on. And during this period, she was mostly experimenting with pictorialism, which we will also talk a little bit more about in just a moment here. So for this presentation, I chose 3 of her veiled figure photographs to focus on. But I do want to note that she took other photographs during this period with veiled figures. I just chose these 3 because I felt that the veiled figure was most prominent in these, so it gives us a really good example. Okay, so let's just dive in. So here is one example from 1910. This one is titled "The Wood Beyond the World," and it was named after an 1894 novel by William Morris. Here's another, this one's called "Veiled Woman," also 1910. And this one is called "The Wind," also from 1910. So these photographs were, the figures in them were her own colleagues and friends and neighbors, and they were taken in the area surrounding her house and studio. Okay, so let's talk about pictorialism a little bit. So it was a movement in photography. Generally, the dates are defined approximately 1885 to 1915. There were people obviously who worked in this style after 1915, and there were some who were experimenting before 1885, but those are the approximate dates. This style was all about thinking about photography as an art form rather than a documentary method. So they sought to elevate photography. Rather than just point and shoot photography, they experimented with technique and they manipulated their photographs to get certain artistic effects. They were very interested in composition and tone, shape, shadow, things like that. And so we often get these very dreamlike, soft focus photos from this movement. So historians have noted how pictorialist photographers drew on other artistic movements that were happening at the time, such as Impressionism or tonalism, or even in some cases, Victorian genre painting. And the reason that they drew on these traditions and thought about them in their work was, again, because they were trying to elevate photography to the world of art. So we can see how these ideas were kind of used by Cunningham in these photographs. For example, the way she treats light and shadow in many ways could be compared to Impressionism or tonalism. And the contemplative symbolic nature of the photographs also could be parallel to tonalism. For this talk though, I'm interested in how, although Cunningham aesthetically might have been thinking about Impressionism or tonalism, the subject matter, the veiled figure, kind of alludes to a neoclassic tradition. So let's talk a little bit about the veiled figure and what it means, how it affects the viewer. So the veil separates the viewer from the subject of the photograph. It creates this distance and obscures the face of the figure. We know who these models were. They were her friends and colleagues. We know where they were taken, but she still uses this veil to obscure the face, which I think is really interesting. One possible reason she did this was it kind of brings this element of universality into the photographs. So the draped clothing and the outdoor setting without references to a specific place or point in time, it doesn't pin the photograph down to a specific location or time. It could exist anywhere at any time in history. And the aesthetic properties of the veil itself also would have presented unique opportunities for Cunningham to experiment with those things that we said were important to pictorialism, like light and shadow, form, and they help give it that dreamlike quality. Okay, so these may have been reasons that Cunningham was drawn to the veiled figure, but I believe that there's also an ideological reason she may have chosen to veil her subjects. And that is to elevate her photography, again, from that documentary photography to art. So these images are highly theatrical. The figures were consciously dressed and staged by Cunningham. And to me, one of the most important ways that she placed her photos in the realm of fine art was by consciously staging them and by drawing on a very traditional academic art tradition, which is neoclassicism. And so we will talk about how she referenced this art tradition. So the early 1800s saw a lot of rediscovery of classical sculpture. And we see this kind of resurgence of aesthetic ideals. So for example, here we see the Venus de Milo, which was rediscovered in 1820. And so artists were looking at these classical Greek and Roman sculptures and trying to emulate them in their own work. They were kind of seen as this ideal that all of these artists, especially sculptors, were striving towards during this period. And so these figures were often draped with these very flowy fabrics. And so that became popular in sculpture, especially in the 1800s. So here I've got a few pictures. So this is a sculpture by Giovanni Strozza from the early 1850s, The Veiled Virgin. Here we have a couple sculptures by Raphael Monti. We have Veiled Lady and the Veiled Woman. He was very into veiled figures. So, and then here we have Giuseppe Croft with Veiled Bust. So for me, it's hard to look at Cunningham's pictorialist veiled figure photographs and not see the parallels with these 19th century sculptures. So if we put them side by side, we can really see how, Cunningham staged her photographs and draped the figures in a way that's very reminiscent of these 19th century sculptures. Here we even have the kneeling figure with the veil across the face. And then here we can kind of see that the flowing fabric that's being blown by the wind. So I believe that in these photographs, Cunningham was referencing this neoclassic tradition. She was drawing on this academic, very academic, respected tradition in art to try to elevate her own photographs from a place just in documentary photography to a place in art history. So that is basically what I have. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, let's open it up to questions real quick. We had a few people join us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if they have a question, they can unmute themselves or put it in the chat. Can
you see me right now, or should I come out of the share mode?
Come out of the share mode for just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go. I hadn't made the connection of those veiled figures with the really I don't want to say decorative, but almost like decorative veiling of the sculptural forms. Once you mentioned that, it was very clear to me that she was definitely looking at those.
Yeah, I hadn't originally thought of that either. I found those images that she had shot really fascinating, and just the more I thought about it, and then I saw those sculptures next to it, it just seemed, especially that one of the kneeling figure, I feel like just those photographs of Cunningham's are very kind of sculptural in nature. So, yeah.
Definitely. Lydia just asked in the chat, what drew you to the work of Cunningham?
So I honestly, most of what I focus on in my research is painting. So photography is kind of new for me. I stumbled across Cunningham's work through my work at the Ulrich, actually. We have a couple of her photographs, and I don't believe we have any of the ones that I put in my PowerPoint, but I just was really attracted to her work. And so I kind of just started looking up her other photographs, and the second photograph I showed, I think, of the kneeling woman, I thought that was such a cool photograph. And so I discovered her through the Ulrich, and then kind of just went on my own little tangent.
I was seeing some scenes almost like referencing paintings by Botticelli, like the theatrical sort of portrait of the two figures in the area. I was seeing some sort of like, I don't know, similar settings and emotions present in the composition.
Yeah, definitely. I could see that.
I
think.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think just in those photographs, the way that she draws on those, because like Impressionism, we think of it now as being solidly in, the art historical canon. But at the time that, it was a new movement, it was kind of radical. So I think that the fact that she draws on those very academic established traditions speaks to how she was trying to establish her own photography within, the respected art history tradition.
Yeah, totally. Really fighting for a spot. I like that.
Yeah.
I did wonder when I think of veil, it's kind of intuitively in my mind, I think of marital dress. I wondered if there was, if you had looked into like any references of, I don't know, brides or any sort of, one of the sculptures that you made a comparison to was the Veiled Virgins, that also makes of history of marriage. And I just wondered if you had looked into that at all, or if you think there might be a connection there.
Yeah, I definitely think there could be a connection. I honestly have not really looked into that. When I thought of the Veiled Virgin connection, I thought it was, I guess I approached it more from like a religious standpoint. A lot of times in art, when we see like Mary, for example, she'll have the veil. So I think there's definitely a religious, spiritual element, but the marriage specifically, I hadn't really looked into that. So that would definitely be something to look into in the future.
Awesome. Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions that have joined in? All right. Well, if not, I just want to say thank you so much, Nellie. It was
thank you.
Great to have you here and participate in our lecture series.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, it's great having you.